So I wanted to come on here and make this video to get something off of my chest as we as women kind of have discussions about uniting, particularly as black women, women of the diaspora. It's become very clear to me based off of social media, whether it's YouTubers, Twitter, Instagram, uh, certain situations that have happened with Amanda Seals, Lovey, etc., that there's a lot of buying into this concept of uh, a diasporic hierarchy that pretty much puts Africans, continental Africans at the top, Caribbeans second, and African Americans at the bottom. And what I want to say is there's no way in hell that we're going to unite as women if we're going to hold on to these kinds of hierarchies. It's basically a remix of patriarchy. It's essentially nationalism um, with a female face. And it's going to get in the way of building sustainable relationships and connections with other women. I used to be a big fan of Amanda Seals. But when she came recently to Lovey's defense, who Lovey is Nigerian American, I think for a lot of people, most people are kind of going to give Lovey a chance. She has her way with words. She can be funny, she can be witty, but she has stepped her foot in places and criticizing African Americans, going so far as to write essays against reparations for African Americans, even though she is not a descendant of slavery. Um, and just showing a lack of respect and not honoring boundaries. And then to have Amanda Seals, who is half African American, half Caribbean, but more rooted in her Caribbean identity, kind of come to Lovey's defense when no one asked her to, is disappointing. Only to find out that she then, wrote an article or had an interview saying that, she's very happy about having her Caribbean background because she feels that African Americans have an identity crisis. That's a really fucking loaded thing to say. But you know what? Unfortunately, it's not an uncommon feeling and ideology. And to be quite honest with you, this hierarchy is seeping into conversations about black women uniting and the divine feminine and, just women coming together, period. It is getting in the way of these conversations. And it's frustrating. It's frustrating. It's disrespectful. It's unnecessary. And there's a lot of people who spend so much time criticizing African Americans and what African Americans are doing or not doing while ignoring the shit in their own backyards. Okay? See, it's very easy to find what's wrong with African Americans because so much of our dysfunction is on display for the whole world to see, pick apart, and judge, while everyone else sort of hides their dysfunction. And please believe there's plenty of shit that we could talk about in other people's backyards that we don't. And it's very interesting how people decide that they want to have boundaries with their own identity and their own culture that they don't respect in African Americans. In this conversation about spirituality and women tapping into their divine nature, there is definitely a tone and an attitude that African American women, women of the American chattel slavery, women with Southern roots, black Southern roots, are somehow less spiritual or somehow less attuned to nature or somehow less quote unquote deep than maybe continental Africans or Caribbeans. And all it's doing is adding on to the hierarchy. And all it is basically nationalism and tribalism remixed and recreated. And you can't build any kind of sustainable relationship. If that's really what you want to do, You can't do that coming into the conversation thinking that you're better than X, Y, and Z. And the reality is, if you come to a country, if you move to a country, you have to show respect to the people that have been there. It really, there's no ifs, ands, or buts. You definitely can have your opinions. There's definitely things you may not agree with. There are going to be dysfunctions that you see, but you're seeing it because you moved to that country. But to pretend like you get to just disregard those people, you get to label them as having an identity crisis, you get to act as if, you know, your views on spirituality are somehow superior than, is going to get in the way of trying to bond and build connections with those people if that's really what you want to do. Part of this conversation is going to have nuance, because African American women, you know, had to retain or let go of certain cultural identities within a majority white country. That's not something that, you know, most of the Caribbean can say. That's not something that, you know, African countries can really say. For the most part, you know, those parts of the world, the islands, West Africa, they're majority black, or at the very least, they're majority non-white. The way you navigate things is going to be different from the way African American women navigate things, and that's fucking okay. You cannot sit here and act like it is automatically superior than the way African American women do things. That's a problem. I'm telling you, that is a problem, and there is some nationalistic bullshit and tribalism going on that people need to check at the door before thinking they are qualified to discuss women uniting. Because we can't unite if you got a flag in my face every 2 seconds. Be proud of who you are, absolutely. You know, there's so much stuff to learn from everybody's background and everybody's culture. But what we can't do is pretend like some people's culture and background is somehow more spiritual and just more attuned and just better than because African Americans live in majority white countries, or because majority white country, or because you're privy to certain dysfunctions that may not necessarily see in your background. But please believe, for everything that you can complain about African Americans, you can definitely damn sure say about Caribbean women or West African women or African women, period. You know, I think we're seeing this manifest with the Cynthia Erivo bullshit with Harriet Tubman. At this point, it shouldn't even be a conversation. The bitch can't play Harriet Tubman because she sat up there and she disrespected African Americans and she co-signed somebody disrespecting African Americans. And what real unity as women looks like is for Caribbean women and for African women to stand up and say, you know what, y'all are absolutely right. If this was on the other, you know, if the shoe was on the other foot, you know, and someone disrespected our people, they definitely cannot play a historical, iconic figure of our background. That's just respect. That's just respect. That's what allyship looks like. That's what sisterhood looks like. But instead, it becomes an opportunity to lecture African Americans on issues that ain't got nothing to do with nothing. She overstepped the boundary. She disrespected us. The end. That's it. You want to have a conversation? Listen, if Forrest Whitaker, if you find something telling me Forrest Whitaker says some foul shit about Ugandans, then hey, we can make a comparison. But that shit didn't happen. So before people even try to make those comparisons, let's understand something from the gate. This person has been disrespectful, and they co-signed somebody who was disrespectful. Lovey. And I'm very disappointed to see women sit here and talk about female empowerment and unity and the divine feminine. But the moment African Americans, it's about, like, the moment we become the center of the conversation, it's all negative. It all becomes ways to argue against us, ways to discredit us, ways to talk down to us, ways to lecture us, ways to, you know, pretend like we're not making valid points and just argue for the sake of arguing. It's like, where the hell is the unity in that? I don't understand. Because we know if it was the other way around, there would be a rallying cry and a war cry to cut people down, you know, for overstepping certain cultural boundaries. Something that I found on Twitter that was really um, valuable was in the midst of all this chaos that has happened, there's been a lot of uh, snide comments and remarks about African Americans not having culture, quote unquote culture. And the problem with that is people who come from, again, majority black or majority non-white countries, viewing African Americans from that lens. We come from a majority white country. There's a lot of things we had to either hide, we had to either get rid of, but we always retained something. And that is worth acknowledging. You can't ignore that, you can't downplay that, you can't disrespect that, you can't pretend like that's not relevant. And you don't get to act like because that didn't happen to you, that somehow makes you superior in some kind of authority in all things spiritual, because it doesn't. It doesn't. If we've been navigating this shit all this time to the best of our ability, you got to respect that. You got to honor that, period. But this was a point by a woman named Ebony Elizabeth. Her Twitter handle is called @EbonyTeach. And she says, friendly reminder that all humans have specific cultures, even those whom you think don't. Here's the cultural iceberg model. And I guess it was created by someone named Hall. And the cultural iceberg model basically has a picture of an iceberg. At the top, you have the exposed part of the iceberg, and at the bottom is the rest of the iceberg that's submerged in water, which is what you don't see. And at the top of the cultural iceberg is called your surface culture. And part of that are your food, flags, festivals, fashion, holidays, music, performances, dances, games, arts and crafts, literature and language. That's surface culture. It's not that it's not important, but it's surface culture. And see, that's what a lot of people are basing their identity on, is surface culture. And that's what they're judging African Americans for either having or not having. Even though we definitely have many of those things, the problem is so much of it is intertwined in American culture that people automatically dismiss it. And a big thing is flags. And it's like, because African American, the flag would be the American flag, and it's not something else, people feel like, again, it can be dismissed. But then at the bottom is deep culture. And deep culture is basically divided into different categories. Deep culture includes communication styles and rules. That's category number 1. This includes facial expressions, gestures, eye contact, body language, tone of voice, handling and displaying of emotions, etc. Category number 2 are notions of. This could be notions of courtesy and manners, friendship, leadership, cleanliness, modesty, and beauty. Concepts of. This is the 3rd category. These are concepts of self, time, past and future, fairness and justice. Roles related to age, sex, class, family. The 4th category are attitudes toward elders, adolescents, dependents, expectations of work authority, cooperation versus competition, relationships with animals. And then the last category of deep culture are approaches to religion, courtship, marriage, raising children, decision making, and problem solving. Anybody who gives 2 shits about anybody would know that everybody's got that. So when you sit here and you come to these conversations about women uniting and culture and this, that, and the third, blase, blase, and you say African Americans don't have culture, what you're basically saying is, number 1, you don't respect them, you don't give a shit about learning about their culture, you think it's not relevant. And if that's the case, you are not qualified to talk about women uniting, the divine feminine, or anything like that. Everybody needs to put that nationalism at the door, because nobody is better than anybody. Nobody is better than anybody. And there's a lot of people who have this misguided concept in the diaspora that just because, they feel like there is this fine line between being proud of who you are and where you come from, which is certainly a part of women stepping into ourselves. You have to have a pride in where you come from. You have to have a pride in your family background and all of these things. And your culture is definitely a part of that. How, Zeneva? There's a fine line between that and stepping into the realm of tribalism and nationalism. And there's a lot of y'all stepping into that realm of tribalism and nationalism that needs to get reined in if we're going to have a conversation about women coming together. Until that can happen, and until there's truly a mutual respect and mutual allyship and a mutual feeling that everybody's history is relevant, and particularly that there is homage given to people who came before you. Because like I said before, if you move to a country, you got to show respect for the people that have been there before you. And in the United States, the black native population here are so-called African Americans, black Americans. And if you're living in America, you need to show respect to that, period. Nobody says you need to kiss anybody's ass. Nobody says you can't critique people if they say something offensive to you or they say something that's out of ignorance. That's fine. But what we cannot do is sit here and pretend like you can just dismiss African Americans when you want to. You can just downplay, talk down to, and lecture and treat African American women as if they are somehow the problem child of the diaspora. That is not going to work. And if that is your approach to women empowerment, I'm telling you right now, it's flawed. It's flawed. And it's basically the patriarchy with the female form. Because you're basically doing the foot soldier work for nationalism and tribalism. And you need to check yourself.